All right. I mentioned, I think in this class, every state had property qualifications as a prerequisite for voting. Most states, most people didn't even question that. They just assumed that property owners were better people than people who didn't. Essentially, folk, and this is simply a fact of life, they did not want the poor people to vote. And of course, they still don't. Well, okay, your comment is welcome. If you want to make a comment, it's welcome. But they didn't want poor people to have a say-so in government. And they did not want women to have a say-so, and of course slaves could not vote either. Indians could not vote. So who was we the people? We the people were your more successful white men. Again, folks, something I must say about history, you have to judge these people by the time period that they lived. Now, if you measure them by a 2019 yardstick, they will come across as being racist, sexist, and a whole lot of other things. I mean, but again, these people they lived in their own time era. And someday, 100 years from now, people might judge us by 2119 standards, and we might come up quite short or appear to be quite ignorant by 2119 standards. But you have to judge these people according to the standards that they lived, and not try to judge them by your own standards or your 2019 standards. Again, if you do, you're going to wind up hating every one of them. Now, as you get older, you have fewer and fewer heroes in your life. You find out that this hero of yours, a pretty thought hero, had a serious weakness, and that person had a serious weakness. Read biographies like I do, study these people. It is true, George Washington, you could call him a whiner. He was a slave owner. He believed only property owners should vote. Again, he was the man of his time period. Yet you have to judge him by the standards of his day and not judge him by the standards of our time. Again, with a lot of us are judging these people by the standards of our time. And hey, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and every once in a while they make up a brand new rule. I mean, I've been here 15 years, and all of a sudden the streets become one-way streets. You go to work one day and don't know that all the streets are one-way streets, and you go the wrong way on a one-way street and wind up getting a ticket because of a new rule that they made up that you were not aware of. And again, this is the way life is sometimes. So, all right. Slavery, again, folks, this is a big issue that we'll have, and it ultimately led to a war in which 500,000 men died on the battlefield, not to mention men who died from disease, or wounded men whose lives were permanently damaged, crippled for life as a result of the war. But slavery was a big problem. And during the period of the Articles of Confederation, the 10-year period when we were under the Articles, only Vermont had a constitution that outlawed slavery. Then later, New York and New Hampshire, New York and New Hampshire both claimed Vermont. As you may know, eventually Vermont became its own state, controlled neither by New York or New Hampshire. Massachusetts used the courts to outlaw slavery. The highest court in Massachusetts eventually outlawed it. Slaves simply ran away in a lot of other northern states. Pennsylvania was the first state to eliminate slavery by statute. That is, where the legislature met. And keep in mind, Pennsylvania only had one house, a one-house legislature. They only had, they didn't have a governor, but their one house eliminated slavery, but the elimination is gradual. In other words, they had a law that a slave could only serve for maybe 10 years or 15 years or 20 or 25 years. And then after that period of time, the slave was to be freed. So they gradually eliminated slavery. One good feature about the gradual elimination of slavery was all slaves did not become loose at once and then find that they had to all of a sudden find jobs. The slaves were freed a few at a time, and then the whole place was not burdened with a whole bunch of unemployed former slaves going around looking for work. Places like Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, they had anti-slavery bills come before their legislatures, but they were rejected. In the deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, slavery was so entrenched that freeing slaves was unthinkable. A lot of the slaves defected to the British during the Revolutionary War and the British freedom. Some of them went to Africa, some to England, some to Canada. All right.
There he is. I was just talking about you.
Now,
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
This is Professor Dunn.
I'm Ron, I have repeated some of the stuff that's already been said.
You're done? Are you done?
No, I'm almost in December.
All right.
Yes, I have watched
Yeah,
her.
downtown. That's right.
I have watched her.
Yeah, she was telling me about that.
There were some cases where the people rebelled.
Really?
Yeah, I struggle on that.
For instance, Pennsylvania had a rebellion against the tax that was levied,
Like 20 points above.
About 10 points.
but the tax,
That sounds about right.
well, the tax stood. The rebels fled when an army was moved against them.
Yes, good stuff.
All right, now the Constitution. James Madison called for a meeting of the colonial delegates to meet in Annapolis, Maryland. Only a few delegates actually showed up.
There.
But one of the delegates, a man named Alexander Hamilton, his picture is on the $10 bill to give you some idea how important he was. He said that the federal government should be more powerful than it actually is. Essentially, he said the power of the central government was just too weak. So the few of them who were there decided, well, we don't have enough persons here to really be effective, so let's meet again in Philadelphia. So months later, they met again in Philadelphia, and the ones who met in Philadelphia were among the wealthier people of the colonies. Now, again, folk who want to criticize our country, and we have a lot of people who do, will say that our country was founded by the wealthy, the rich, and it was founded in such ways to benefit the rich. There is some truth in that. Again, folks, you can find fault with anything you want to find fault with. I mean, it's there. All right. Anyway, a lot of these people were young. George Washington presided over the meeting. Ben Franklin was present. I've already mentioned how the delegates met secretly. That way they could change their minds because they wouldn't feel like that where someone said, hey, you took my side of the issue and now you're taking the other side, you're a traitor. So they met in secret. The Constitution has been called a bundle of compromises, but the great compromise was where that each state would have 2 senators. That way in the Senate, each state would be equally represented. But in the House, it would be proportional population. With a greater, the states with the most people would have more House members than the states with fewer. Based on population. Slaves, they finally decided to count slaves as a 3/5 of a person. The South wanted to count them for representation, but not for taxation. The North said, hey, that isn't fair. Count them either for none or for both. So they finally worked out that a slave was to be counted as 3/5 of a person. It's called the 3/5 compromise. Again, now, we can criticize them. And I don't want to sweep it under the rug. I mean, it's there. But these people were prisoners to their own time period, even as all of us are, whether we realize it or not. Slaves, again, the word slave does not appear in the Constitution. They're called other persons or such persons. And if you actually read the Constitution, one line in the Constitution says, until the year 1808, such persons may be imported, but after the year 1808, the other persons may not be. In other words, basically the slave trade was allowed to go on until the year 1808, and after the year 1808 it was to be stopped. This represents the hope that somehow our country would find a way to solve the slavery issue. In other words, let the next generation figure it out. Again, I can't really fault, well, maybe I should fault them. I mean, I had a close friend one time who, she was a woman friend. She dated a man for 3 years and never did work through the problems, but said, well, let's go ahead and let's just get married and we'll solve our problems afterward. They got married, were married for 3 years and finally divorced. Something similar almost happened to the United States. They said, well, we don't know about the issue of slavery, but somehow or another we'll solve it. Let the next generation figure it out. And but let's just us get together anyway and form a union. So they formed a union without really answering the issue of slavery. To show that they were ambivalent about it, they did outlaw the slave trade after the year 1808. And up in the Northwest Territory, they did outlaw slavery in places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So that shows that they were somewhat they had misgivings about the institution. All right. The president was to be chosen by electors, and folks, somehow or another, I never hear this fact mentioned, but the reason for the Electoral College was to make sure that only top men chose the president. In other words, your property owners voted for the state legislators. The state legislatures then chose the electors. Then the electors met, they went one time, and they chose the president. This was to make the president far removed from the ordinary people. The Electoral College is still there. It's a hot issue. There have been several presidents who have been elected by the Electoral College who were minority presidents, among them Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson and Donald Trump. Without the Electoral College, Donald Trump would not have won the presidency. I think almost everyone here knows that. But it's a fact of life. I mean, it's there, and until it's amended, it will stay there. When it was over with, no delegate was happy with every provision in the Constitution, but 39 of the delegates signed it. Then they had to get the Constitution ratified by the states. 9 states had to ratify it rather than 7. 7 would have been a simple majority. You know, they said we want 9 states to ratify it, and special conventions would be set up rather than allowing the legislatures that existed to ratify it. So the idea was to try to sneak the ratification past everybody. And again, I can't say as I blame them, because if they had required unanimity, they would the Constitution would never have started. Getting 9 states to approve was a big task. For one thing, the most populous states had too many people who were against it. Eventually, 2 parties were formed. The Federalists, who wanted a strong central government, wanted approval, and the Anti-Federalists, the only thing about them was they were against the Constitution. Nothing else. They stood for nothing except being against the Constitution. We've had that down through history. The Whig Party stood for nothing except to oppose Andrew Jackson. And then today there's one party that's being accused of doing nothing but trying to oppose the government as it is. But anyway, I'll leave that. But anyway, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists mounted their campaign Georgia feared the Spanish and the Indians, so Georgia lived right next to Florida, as you may know. And the Indians were there, the Spanish were there. So they ratified it quickly. Massachusetts had a vigorous newspaper campaign that swung the votes in its favor. By May 1788, 8 states had ratified. The Anti-Federalists mounted a vigorous campaign. Their big fear was that the government would become too tyrannical, become a tyrant. They also feared that government officials would always come from the rich. That's another way of saying rich, the elite. And here was a valid argument. They also claimed the Constitution did not protect civil liberties. In other words, there was no Bill of Rights. To counter this, and this was a genuine reason to be afraid of it, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay promised that the Bill of Rights will be added if you'll accept the Constitution now as it is. We will add a Bill of Rights later. In the end, New Hampshire became the 9th state to decide, and with that, the Constitution was ratified. Virginia, very famous Americans, Madison, Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason, these men made the outcomes uncertain. But Virginia was finally won over when it was promised that a Bill of Rights would be added. We'll talk about the Bill of Rights in a few minutes. 3 men, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, wrote a series of papers known as the Federalist. These papers were sent to all 13 of the colonies, and they explained what the Constitution would mean if it were ratified. A lot of persons have devoted a lot of their lives to studying these papers. And in other words, what power would each branch of government have? One thing they did not foresee, folk, was the Supreme Court assuming the power of judicial review, which actually made the Supreme Court has made the Supreme Court the strongest branch of government. Now, newspaper debate, heavy lobbying influenced a lot of delegates to switch their votes who were against it to becoming for it. And when news arrived that Virginia had ratified the Constitution, that persuaded a lot of delegates to accept it also. North Carolina and Rhode Island were left out. Turned out Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution. Now, I mentioned slavery was an issue. There was another issue that we'll talk about plenty later, was what if a state wanted to leave the Union once it joined? Without there being any written provision to say so, some states were told, oh, anytime you want to leave, you're welcome to do so. Now, I think a lot of you may know this was to lead to a 4-year-long civil war also. The issue of whether or not a state had the right to leave the Union, this was debated back and forth for a time. Then a bunch of states did leave the Union. Then it was understood that no state could, but in recent years there has been a move for states to leave the Union, and last year California was supposed to vote it whether they stay in the Union or leave. The vote was never taken. So this is still an issue, but there's no written provision that says that a state, once it joins, is allowed to leave. But some of the states, particularly South Carolina, understood that they could leave if they wanted to. But again, this was an issue that was never discussed, never resolved. Let the next generation figure it out. Your book asks the question, was the United States a Christian country? The Constitution had no mention or little mention of Christianity. and no provision for state support of any church. Now, folks, this is very important. George Washington believed that the state should support the church. But Thomas Jefferson argued that no, the church would be better off if it is funded only by voluntary contributions, and that preachers would be paid only by voluntary contributions, and no tax money should pay any preachers, or no tax money should pay for any church property. And eventually Jefferson's view prevailed. Now I want to state this, folks. The church is still doing fairly well in this country, particularly here in the South, what's called the Bible Belt. In Europe, the state does support the church, and only 2% of Europeans attend church regularly. 2%. European churches sit empty. So the view that the state should not give money to the church won out. This also makes the church more independent. When the church knows it's not going to get any money from the state, even though up until the 1840s, some states did support some churches. The federal government, for the most part, never has. Now again, if you do some research, you'll find there are some exceptions. A lot of persons did not want, again, I mentioned this already, did not want Catholics or Jews to be able to hold office. And the folk, again, this is like the issue of slavery. It's there. I'm not going to try to sweep it under the rug. It is a fact of life. There was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment throughout much of our history. I saw it strongly when I was 11 years old when John Kennedy ran for president. And a lot of persons would not vote for him because he was a Catholic. My mother told me about in 1928, she was 6 years old, but a Catholic also had run for president. He got nowhere. There were a lot of persons who believed that Catholics should not be allowed to hold office, and again, this is simply an ugly fact of life. But again, we're going to be talking about this from time to time. So again, don't anyone try to think that I'm being anti-Catholic or anti-Jew. I mean, my wife is Jewish. I voted for a Catholic for president one time. I won't tell you who I'm not supposed to, but I did vote for a Catholic for president one time. I have voted for Catholics for other office, so I have no problems with Catholics holding office, but a lot of people down throughout history have. And at first, most of the colonies did have religious restrictions on who could vote or hold office. You had to be a church member. Up until 1840, there were restrictions on Jews holding office in some states. The founders just took for granted that most citizens were Christian. Again, I throw this stuff in italics. It's not in a book, but it's my throwing in. It was to be the 20th century before any Catholic ran for president. Today, there are a few politicians today who will admit to being an atheist. For the most part, you have to be a member of a church to get elected. That's not written down in the Constitution of any state. It's just that people expect it of you. All right, well, I'm going to think about Margaret Thatcher. Eventually became Prime Minister of Britain, but the first time she ran for Parliament, she was soundly whipped. Now, there was no law that stated that a person to be elected to Parliament had to be married and had to have children. But Margaret Thatcher was unmarried, no children. People wouldn't vote for her. I mean, it wasn't against the law for her to run, but people would vote for her. So years later, she married, had 2 children, she ran again, and this time she got overwhelmingly elected and worked her all the way up to prime ministership. It's just, again, it's people in England at that time were prejudiced towards office holders being family people, either family man or family woman. All right. Okay. All right, chapter 9.